My peeps, this is a big week in history. You know history's my favorite. It is. I'll just tell you that. If you haven't picked up on it, it's my favorite. And this week we're going to look at how our history all the way from week 2 to now is connected. These are big events in this little timeline of what's happening. And we're going to see how they're all connected, how everything has been pushing us to this point, to where we have the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, and Joan of Arc. So you're going to have to stick with me, because we're going to go back to William the Conqueror. And what did he do? He defeated King Harold, and he became the King of England, right? So my question is, where was William from? Because whenever he conquered England, it's not like he lost the land that he had where he came from, right? So let's look at this map. I'm going to show you this map out of this lovely book. So up here we've got, this is France and Normandy. We talk about the Norman Conquest. You know, in our timeline song, we sing the Norman Conquest. This is what we're talking about. William the Conqueror was a Norman Viking. So we've got Normandy, we've got England. So when William the Conqueror, and he had other lands, but when he became King of England, he didn't lose that land that he had in France. So now we've got a little land down below England and France, and we've got the country of England, the King of England. He's in control of all that land now, okay? He also started feudalism, which is important. So, I've written this down so that I can try to be as concise as I can. I've read a lot of different books. I've been researching this and trying to get you a nice little nugget so you can understand how these all connect. But the best thing that you can do, really, is read about it for yourself. This book is awesome. It's so good. Story of the World, I love it. I know I'm always telling you guys to read this, but it's got a really great chapter on all this stuff. It explains it much better than I can. But I'm going to give you a little review if you've already read, and maybe a little introduction if you've never learned about this before. So we've got Normandy's in France. This is where William the Conqueror is from. Okay, so we've got England and France. Now, this sparked, from that point on, France didn't like that England owned land in France. They didn't really like England having any control over their land in France. So let's move on though. We've got Richard the Lionhearted, who was the son of Eleanor of Aquitaine. So my question to you is, where is Aquitaine? Because she is Eleanor of Aquitaine. She's inheriting Aquitaine. Remember I told you that when she was time for her to get married, there were lots of men who'd like to marry Eleanor of Aquitaine so they could have control of this land that she would inherit. Aquitaine is in France. Big area in France. So when she married Henry II, now England's got England. It's got the Normans' land, and now it's got Eleanor of Aquitaine. So it keeps gaining land in France. Do you think the French like that? They didn't like it. They didn't like England having it. So there was lots more conflict, more battles, more wars. Remember we talked about Prince John and how he had to pay for these battles that were happening down in France, and that's why he was really taxing the people to death, is trying to pay for this stuff. All right, so like a king and a queen, the way that it would work is for you to become king, in most cultures it was because of what your blood. It was who your daddy was. So if your daddy was king and you were the oldest son, when your daddy died, you would become king. And then when you died, your brother would become king. And then everybody's hoping that y'all have sons so that your son can become king, so they can keep it in this bloodline family, okay? So that was in most cultures, that's how it went. Now, we know that that's not always how people became king. How did William become king? He conquered. So there were other ways that you could become king, but generally speaking, it was in your bloodline. It means in the family. So now you can see now. We've got England and France, and they're kind of tangled up, right? We've got this French lady down here who's got all this land. She couldn't become the sole leader. Back then, women really couldn't, like a queen couldn't be like the sole monarch. It really was the king. So she, she'd get married, but when she got married, whoever she married, they then got control of this land. So when she married Henry II, England's got England. Now it's got this land in Aquitaine. So we've got, and it happened. It wasn't just those two. There were French women marrying English nobility. And so it was just kind of all tangled up. And it really muddied the waters to be able to see, what land belongs to which country. Like France didn't like this. So they're trying to get England to stop. That's why they're fighting. They're like, we will kill people in war to get you to get out of this land. And it went on for a long time. But the big event that happened was when Charles III claimed to be King of France. Now, he didn't just do this for no reason. He had a reason for it. When I heard that, I was like, why did he do that? Why would he be such a stinker to just say, I'm King of France? Well, it wasn't just that he was being a stinker. It was that he thought, his argument for it was, well, my grandmother, or his great-grandmother, it was in his bloodline that he had a French queen. And so he believed that he was the rightful heir to the throne of France because he's related to a French queen, Isabella. And the French are saying, no, Charles III of England, you are not now the whole King of France. There's somebody else in line before you. So that was where they had opposing sides. England said he was king. France is like, no, you're not. But it all came down to this family tree. It's a complicated family tree where you can see where Charles III is coming from and where France is coming from. And so they had to battle this out because both of them thought they were right. So why did it go on for 100 years? This is where we're going to get to the Black Death. But first of all, it was really expensive. Like we said, King John, he was taxing the people to death because it would cost a lot of money to keep these wars going. So it was really expensive for France. It was expensive for England. And neither one of them had the ability, the money to just keep pouring money for years and years and years into these battles. So it drug on. And the other reason that it lasted for so long is because fleas on rats carried the Black Death to Europe, and it killed a lot of people. So the story goes that these rumors of this illness that was killing people, and they were getting these huge lumps. They'd get these big lumps up under their armpits, and their lymph nodes would just be swollen. They'd turn black. And they'd get really sick, fever, chills, bad illness. It was killing people. Started hearing rumors of this in Asia. And then eventually it came to Italy. And then from Italy, remember it's our country to boot, it spread up north and all into Europe. So there were rats on these ships. There were rats all over the place in the medieval times. And they didn't have like dumpsters like we do now. They didn't have their sewage and their trash. It wasn't like it is today. It was, a lot of times it would end up in the street. Well, rats, they flourished in this environment because they had plenty to eat. There were things to eat everywhere. So there were lots of rats. And some rats came in on a ship that landed in Italy, and the people on the ship were so sick. And so the Italian leaders were like, no, you're not coming off the ship. You have to stay on the ship. You're not coming off and getting all of us sick. And even though they made those people stay on the boat, guess what happened? People were still getting sick. People started getting sick on the land. And so it was because the rats were carrying the disease. And they would crawl down the ropes of the ship that were anchored to shore, and they went into the city, and that's how they got sick. But it wasn't the rats that were biting people. There were fleas, little tiny blood-sucking insects. And they were biting the fleas, or biting the rats. And when they would bite, they broke through the skin and got some of that bacteria that was of the disease that was in the rat. And then that disease went into the flea's digestive system. because they suck blood, because that's what they eat. And so it went into their digestive system, and now they have the disease. And then they go and they bite. They were biting people. And when they bite people, they also break the skin. And so then they were giving the disease with that bacteria to the people. The people got very sick, and 1 out of 3 died. It wiped the population out. They couldn't figure out what in the world was going on. They didn't know what was causing this horrible illness. Some people thought it was a judgment from God. Just didn't know. They didn't know where it was coming from, and so they tried to take measures to stop it, but they didn't know. And they didn't have the same medicine that we have today. They didn't have all of the technology that we have today to figure out where is the disease coming from. So it just made it really difficult for them to stop the spread of this disease. Okay, so they didn't know it was coming from the rats. It wasn't for many, many years later, many hundreds of years later actually, before they learned the scientific reason for the disease, which was that fleas on rats were spreading the Black Death around. So, bottom line, plague was nasty. It was bad. It was a horrible sickness. It really, really killed a lot of people. It was 1 in 3 Europeans, but I read that it killed roughly half the population of France. This is super creepy. This is what a plague doctor looked like. He would wear this long beak-looking thing when he would go in to check on people. He had goggles on and a hat. He tried to protect himself from the ill, the people that were sick that he would go in there. So he really tried to protect himself. But then when he went outside, he'd take his mask off. And where was the disease coming from? Could he still get sick even if he protected himself when he was around sick people? If he got bit by a flea that was on this diseased rat, then he could get the plague. So they really tried to protect themselves. They carried around like garlic and herbs, and they ate lots of healthy foods trying to help themselves from getting sick, but they weren't thinking that it was the fleas at the time. They didn't know. So why is it significant? Why does it matter? It's fascinating, right? This crazy illness. But why is it significant? Well, this happened right in the middle of the 100 Years' War. So it interrupted the 100 Years' War. It's another reason why this war went on for so long, is because a ton of people died. So their armies were depleted. They just lost a lot of people. So another reason why it is significant is because the plague changed society forever. After the plague, things started changing. This is what really started to take down feudalism. Was not a leader. It wasn't a king. It wasn't the people voting in and rebelling and getting somebody to overthrow the feudal system. It wasn't that. It was the Black Death that started things off. So what happened was a lot of peasants died. And in the feudal system, peasants did a lot of manual labor. They worked on farms. You know, they did all kinds of work, but it was really, really cheap. It was really affordable to pay a peasant to do this work. Well, after the Black Death, a lot of them were wiped out. There were not as many people to work as there was before. And so now, nobles and the more wealthy people of society, there also were not as many as them. But in order for them to have their farm worked on, and in order for them to have the manual labor they needed, the peasants were able to get paid more because there weren't as many of them. They were really needed. They needed them to work. And so the peasants could say, I'll do it, but you're not paying me what you used to. I've got to get paid a whole lot more. And so they'd pay them more money. And then those rich folks in society started to not be as rich as they were because they're not getting to keep all of their money. They're having to pay more wages to workers. So they're losing more of their wealth by paying their workers more. So this is like supply and demand would be the economic phrase for this. I've got to do a lot more studying before I start in on economics. But that's the whole thing, is that peasants were able to make more money. They had more choices as to what kind of jobs they wanted to do, because there were a lot of jobs. There were a lot of different jobs, so they could kind of choose what they wanted to make more money, and the feudal system began to collapse. All right, so now we're going to move into Joan of Arc. I've got a little paper doll of Joan of Arc here. She was a peasant girl in France. She lived in France, and so she wasn't a nobility. She was nobody important. She was just a young gal, 16 years old. She was 16 when she convinced, let me look at my notes here, when she convinced Prince Charles of France. So later he became king, but she was 16 when she convinced him to let her build an army. She believed that she was under divine guidance to do these things. And so this is, after the Black Death is already, happening. So this was in, you know what? I want to see what year this was. Hold on, let me look at what year this was. So this Battle of Orleans was in 1592, and the Black Death was from 1347 to 1351. So this was a long time after the Black Death. But still, this war has been going on for so long. These countries have been through the plague, and they've come out of it, and morale was low. People were kind of tired of fighting, and Joan of Arc, she really got the people fired up again. So she, like I said, she was very young when she got these things going, and she believed that she was working under divine guidance. But no matter what, it was her clear and decisive leadership and enthusiasm that resulted in her leading the French army to this wonderful victory at the Battle of Orleans. So it was a really important battle, and she became a heroine. And even to this day, there's a big celebration in Orleans to remember Joan of Arc leading the victory in the Battle of Orleans. But this wasn't the end of the war. It was more towards the end of the war, but it wasn't the end. And the French king, he could have kept fighting the English, and maybe he would have beat them faster. Maybe the war could have been over a lot faster, but he didn't keep fighting. Joan encouraged him. Let's go to the next battle. Let's go. She was ready to keep leading the army, but the French king said no. He wanted to try to solve things diplomatically, and so there were more like peace talks types of things where, they were talking and trying to work it out instead of fighting it out. And that didn't end up being the end of the war for a much longer time. And sadly, a year later, Joan of Arc was captured, and the English burned her alive at the stake. And so she was only 17, and she has gone down in Catholic history as being a saint, even though it was the Catholic Church who burned her alive at the stake. They said she was a witch. And but then years later, they corrected. The Catholic Church said that was wrong, that they shouldn't have done that to her. She should not have been burned at the stake as a witch. And so now she's named as a saint in the Catholic Church. All right, our history motion. So we're going to start with war. During the 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc, so do a big J, and King Charles VII led the French. So it's an F, and then you just kind of flick it out to the side. The French to defeat the English. And so for English, we just have our hands kind of folded on top of one another like this. For English, this is the sign we use for England in our timeline song. To defeat the English at the Siege of Orleans. So we're doing a big O, and then a little point like their defeat at the Siege of Orleans. And then we have a creepy flea. Fleas on rats carried the plague which killed 1 in 3 Europeans. And we hold it again here. So let's do the motions with the music.
During the 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc and King Charles VII led the French to defeat the English at the Siege of Orleans. In the late 1340s, these on rats carried the plague which killed 1 out of 3 Europeans. In the late 1340s, these on rats carried the plague which killed 1 out of 3 Europeans. During the 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc and King Charles VII led the French to defeat the English at the Siege of Orleans. In the late 1340s, fleas on rats carried the plague which killed 1 out of 3 Europeans. In the late 1340s, fleas on rats carried the plague which killed